Fora TV. The world is thinking.
So thank you for coming to Makers Faire. Here's Adam Savage. How are you guys doing? Hi. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yeah? All right. How many tweeps are here? Twitter people? Oh, I love it. That's great. Okay, so I gave a warning that I was going to come here and talk about failure. And I've been thinking about this talk for a few weeks. I haven't done it at all. I pretty much know how I'm going to begin it, and I pretty much know how I'm going to end it. The whole middle part I'm winging. We say on the show, and I came up with this phrase, failure is always an option. And we put it on our hats, and we talk about it in a very serious way that, you know, a lot of people think of science as this thing that, well, they think of it like Saturday morning cartoons, like the scientist sets up his experiment and then says, darn, my experiment was a failure, or my experiment was a success. And what we like to talk about on the show is that science doesn't work like that. There's not a failure or a success because a scientist doesn't have a preconceived notion of how they want the experiment to turn out. They just want data. So as long as the experiment yields data, it's a good experiment. And we take that very seriously when we tell the stories that we do on Mythbusters about how things work. That's not the kind of failure I wanted to talk about. A lot of people will tell you that failure is a really important way that we learn. But I don't know that I've ever heard really good, juicy, disturbing stories about how much people have failed. That's what I'm going to tell you about. In my life, in my history, I have screwed up innumerable amounts of times. I've been teaching myself some magic tricks lately. I've been teaching myself some cards and some coin magic. And just yesterday, or 2 nights ago, I was practicing this trick in my hotel room in Angels Camp. And yesterday, I took the trick out and I tried to do it for my producer, and I messed it up. And I felt awful. I mean, I felt like I was 12 years old. So I'm still going through the whole process of screwing up all the time. But I want to tell you a couple of grand stories about it. After I left working for Jamie Heineman, around about 1996, 97, I went and worked for a toy company called Primordial that made the building toy Zoob. I spent about a year working for them, but I wasn't making anything there. And actually, it was a turning point for me because I realized that managing this department of R&D for a toy company, which seemed like such a perfect fit for me, didn't involve enough making for me to stay fascinated by it. So I gave notice, I found a replacement, and I quit. And then I started calling Industrial Light and Magic. I called them probably twice a week for 4 months. I had a lot of friends working up there. I just kept on hammering away at every contact I had, and eventually I got hired. And it was like going to heaven. It was the Valhalla I had pictured ever since I was 12 years old and saw Star Wars and decided I wanted to work on special effects movies. And amazingly, I was working on Star Wars. And the thing is that getting up there was so amazing because I had already run myself through these trenches of working in commercials, working on really tight deadlines, and when I got there, I was ready. I was working with these people who are my heroes, incredible wealth of knowledge that all these people had, and there was a tremendous amount of sharing of knowledge. It was a lovely, lovely place to work. And as a freelancer, and that's really what you are when you work in the commercial or special effects and film industry, you're always a freelancer. There are no permanent jobs, which means that you are always wondering what's next. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You might have worked for 3 weeks. Well, you got to look beyond that because you got to pay, next month's rent as well. So in the freelance mindset, you're always trying to line up extra jobs. At ILM, they call them G jobs, government jobs, gravy jobs. And one of the really nice benefits of spending time up at Industrial Light and Magic was that all of a sudden, as a freelancer, when people heard that I worked at ILM, they just hired me. People just started giving me money to do stuff. I worked at ILM, that was good enough for them. They didn't need to see a resume, they didn't need to see a website, they didn't need to interview me. So all of a sudden I was gold. And I think this would be somewhere in late 1999. I got a call from my friend Ben, and he said, that he had this job that everyone else in San Francisco had turned down, but it was very lucrative. It was working for a department store doing a window display. The new ballpark was opening, and they wanted a window display that was a baseball that pitched up and over a fence repeatedly for weeks. And I thought it through, and he said it was like a Monday when he called me. They wanted this installed on that Saturday. And I mean, you know when you call up the fast signs, the rush fee is double. And I knew that if this department store is looking for someone to build this mechanical device into their window in this amount of time, that this is going to be very lucrative. So I started talking with them about what they want, and I started to actually do some research on my own and thinking about how I was going to do it. I figured, this actually could be pretty simple. Maybe I just put a pitching machine on the ground and it pitches a baseball up and over this little fence. I catch it, I reciprocate it back to the pitching machine, and I just keep on going. I bid the job out first I just bid it how I would bid it. I said, well, it's going to take me probably 6 days of work. I'm going to compress that into 5 days. So I'm going to build this per day. It's a rush, so I'm going to double it. It still didn't feel, so there's two ways to bid jobs. One way is to bid it on your hourly rate. And then there's actually a way to bid it on the freelancers know, you bid what the market will bear. And when a department store needs something on a Saturday, you know that you don't want to leave money on the table, especially as a freelancer. So I added another 30% to the bid, and now this felt like a really big fat cat job that I was going to both enjoy and get a new laptop out of. So I started doing it, and I started down the path of going to the space to inspect it. And what they showed me was actually the space was very diabolical in terms of installing into. There was a floor that was only 7 inches high. It was 6 feet wide. And the space itself was 7 feet high. So I had to pitch this baseball almost vertically. And then once it went down behind, I had this 7-inch high stage that I had to let the ball ramp down on. So I went to the hardware store and I set this up in my shop, and I got some PVC tube. I got spandex. I got a lot of spandex to make this big basket back behind the baseball fence so that when the ball went behind, it would both stop and it would find its way down. Now, there turns out, you've seen those sculptures in the airports where the balls reciprocate down the tracks and all of that? There's a reason that they use 2 wires to transfer a ball down a line that I didn't know. You'd think that a pipe might do the same thing, but it doesn't. What happens when you start to run a ball down a round pipe is that instead of just rolling straight down, if it's off angle or something, it can build this little oscillation, which makes it not want to roll down the pipe in any kind of time that makes sense to you or is actually useful. But I figured that was probably solvable, so maybe I just use one baseball and it just reciprocates. It shoots every few minutes. I went to Big 5 Sporting Goods. I bought these relatively professional level pitching machines, which were they're about $300 a piece, and they wanted 3 of these things. So I set up 3 of them, and I went to Grainger, and I managed to find all this lovely stuff. Grainger has these lovely little timer relays in which you can set the time that something gets hit and set the time it sends an electrical signal out with these little arrows. It worked beautifully. I welded a little track that guided the ball towards the baseball pitching machine with the final blast of air that shoved it into the pitching machine at the last minute and popped it over the fence. And when I first did this, it was magnificent. It worked. It worked 10 times in a row, 15 times in a row. 20 times in a row, 25th time, baseball went like horizontal, not over the fence. And I thought, that's why, So I started going back and investigating why it was doing that. One was I was having trouble getting the baseballs to reciprocate correctly because they were taking too long to get down. Then there turned out to be this actual problem I was having. Is if I was running the 3 pitching machines on the same circuit and one went, the drain on the pitching machine from grabbing the ball and throwing it was such that the other pitching machines would slow down. Only by like 10 RPM, but that was enough to actually change the trajectory of the ball. Again, I thought maybe I can time these so that they don't always go at the same time, and I tried doing this. At some point, well, this is also, remember when the Home Depot was open 24 hours a day? I didn't sleep from Wednesday morning until Saturday when I started installing this thing into the department store windows. It was one of the worst all-nighters double all-nighters I've ever pulled. And I was at Home Depot at like 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 7 a.m., days on end. I finally managed to get all of the stuff down to the department store, figuring I'm going to make this work by hook or by crook, because that's what I've done in the commercial industry. Hell, I work at Industrial Light and Magic. I ought to be able to make this work. And I start installing it at like 7 a.m. on Saturday morning, and at 4 p.m., and I start doing everything. Like I start running an air compressor into the back of the PVC to blow the balls down under the stage to get there. When I get there, it turns out their fence is a little higher than they told me. I don't have as much space. I've actually got this target I've kind of got to hit. Later, I found out, well, I'll explain that in a minute. At 4 o'clock on Saturday, after this grueling, I'm trying to work. Oh, and might I point out that this department store treats everyone who works there, even contractors, like thieves. Like you have to have your bag searched going in and leaving, even someone who's installing stuff in their windows. That feels great. This is the other part. Right, I knew the story. So I had, at this point, 8-month-old twins. And my mother was coming into town that afternoon, and so was my sister. And I hadn't seen my wife or my twins at that point in days because I've just been working around the clock. But I figure it's okay, Mom's arriving, I'm going to be able to do this. 4 o'clock rolls around. My mom's arrived at the airport, my wife's going to pick them up. I know this is all happening, and this job isn't working. Like, they're paying me a fortune to do this, and I've never been in this position, but it's not going to happen. And they come to me and they say, how's it going? And I said, it's not going to work. And they were like, what? And I said, it's not going to work. And they said, what are you going to do about it? Now, I had gone through all these things in my head. I'd thought through a whole bunch of different permutations. And I said, well, first I thought about what I'd say to this question, which was, in the next half hour, I'm going to present to you 2 plans. 2 alternative plans. You will choose one, and I will deliver it by tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. And they said, okay, that sounds good. That sounds good. Now I'm starting to think about how much of this money I'm willing to give back because I haven't delivered on this job. And I'm starting to think I have actually earned a certain amount of this money on it just by busting my ass to do it. But, by all rights, if they ask for a bunch back, I'm going to give them a bunch back. But the plan B that we work out is that the balls are now going to be attached to a piece of monofilament, which is just on big wheels that reciprocate. So the ball's going to be slowly moving up and then coming back down, slowly moving up and coming back down. A much more straightforward rig. I go back home. Oh, and so there's my wife wrangling the 8-month-old twins, and my mom's in town sitting at the table with a glass of wine and says, oh, it's so hard for Adam having to work so hard. She says this to her daughter-in-law, wrangling the twins. And my sister says, Adam's wife is working with the twins. And my mom's like, yeah, I know, but he's doing real work. Yeah. My mom is great. She was here last year. So with all of this stress, I managed to deliver the plan B. And I am thinking, I just feel awful. I've never been in this position of not being able to deliver something, of really screwing it up. I didn't realize, well, at any rate, so I managed to build a reciprocating rig. I get it installed. Their head of all display comes into town, takes a look at it and says, this window is great. Those balls on the strings, get rid of them. I don't like them. And they come to me and they say this, and I was like, wow, really? And they said, yeah. Do you want the check now, or do we just send it to your house? And I'm thinking, you're not going to ask me to, I'm ready to give you back half. I'm ready to give you back like 3/4, and they didn't ask for it. Now, this sounds like I got rewarded for this, which you can look at it like that. But I want to point out that one of the things I got out of this, the next story is much worse. One of the things I got out of this was that I probably should have taken note at the very first thing Ben had said to me, which was, this is a job that everyone else had turned down. Later, I learned that there are actually some really interesting aerodynamics of spheres moving through air at slower speeds, that actually past a certain speed, their trajectory can be plotted and predicted really accurately, but below a certain speed, it becomes really erratic. So not only did I have the problem of the RPMs of the pitching machine slowing down to deal with, But I also had the fact that because they were being pitched at a very, very low speed, these vagaries were, I mean, these balls had to go over that fence one every 30 seconds for 6 weeks. So even if I got it one time if I lost one ball out of 500, the machine would be empty by the end of the day. None of these things were things that I had really thought through as significant problems when I started this job. But there's a much bigger screw-up back in the early part of my career. I went to New York University in 1985. I actually spent 6 months in the drama program, and then I dropped out. It's kind of a family chip on the shoulder. I thought I was following in my dad's footsteps by not going to college. I was, but not for the same reasons. But I'd made many of the friends that I still have, many of my best friends, I'd made them there in those 6 months. And most of them went to NYU Film School. And so I spent a huge portion of the 5 years I lived in New York getting a kinds of ersatz NYU film education by working on all of their films. And my very best friend, David Borla, had done this wonderful master's senior thesis film called Gargoyle and Goblin with all these special effects. And we had all these abandoned theaters to film them in, all these abandoned theaters and buildings in Times Square in Manhattan, because his grandmother she owned all the male porn theaters in Midtown. So we had endless amounts of real estate to film in, and it was really amazing time. And again, I was at this point where I had just finished art directing this really big film for him. It was 16 night shoots, all in a row. The crew was sleeping, all in the same kind of dormitory. And I felt like this was something I really could do. I had never tried a project this big before, but here I was feeling like I could do this. And my friend Gabby, now back then in our crowd, you know, when you're like 18, 19, the crowd you run with, it's like everybody, it's a very movable thing. Everyone usually ends up going out with everybody else at some point in the many years that you guys are traveling around together. And I had this very special relationship with Gabby, who was a film student as well. Gabby was a really, really close friend. It was almost romantic, but not quite. But it was a very, very important emotional connection that we had. And she said she'd been asked to produce this kid's senior thesis film. He'd saved up all summer. He'd worked all summer long and lived with his parents in Peoria in order to raise the money to make this film. And he wanted to do a film about an ATM machine that talks back at a guy with a bad toupee. And she asked me if I was willing to art direct it. They only had this budget of $850 to art direct it. And I thought, at that time, $850 seemed like a massive amount of money to do something like this. So I said, absolutely, I can do this. I did Gargoyle and Goblin. I can do your film. What's it going to take? Well, we got to find a space that we can build this ATM machine in. And it turned out that my friend Dave's house out in Brooklyn was perfect. He had this room that nobody used in this big house. The only problem was it had carpeted floors, and we'd never seen an ATM that had carpeted floors. But no worry, because they make these self-sticky floor tiles that we could just put right down. So I put the floor tile on the carpet, and I walked on it for a couple minutes. I peeled it back up, and I didn't feel any residue. And I thought, that's great. We'll just cover the floor with the sticky floor tiles, and then we'll build the ATM machine on top of that. And I had no experience building sets or flats except the sets and flats that I had seen being built when I was in high school. So I went and got a bunch of 1x3-inch pine and a bunch of canvas and a staple gun, and I began to make canvas flats like we'd made in the theater. And I made enough to wall in this ATM machine. And then it came time to, we had to paint it. So I base coated it. And then they said they could have a couple guys paint it while I was working on the ATM machine part. And this is, again, a situation where the thing I thought was going to be simple turned out to be a lot more complicated. The ATM machine, which involved, basically they had some kid, one of their friends with a computer who could make the ATM machine interface. They, all I had to make was a glass front that computer could go up behind, and a little card reader for the card to go in. It seemed really simple, like I said, except that, again, I spent 60 hours sleeping attempting to make this ATM machine work. And at the point at which I got onto the set in Brooklyn, and I'm going back and forth to the set in Brooklyn, which is 12 blocks from the nearest subway station. So every time I'm going to the hardware store to get wood, I'm walking 12 blocks past. There's always this guy practicing a saxophone somewhere along. It feels very weird and romantic. Getting to this set, working alone, coming back to my place in Midtown and trying to work on this ATM machine, and then turns out like the paint that I'm using starts crazing and cracking, and I've got to scrape it off and start again, and then the plexiglass, which is the last $8 I spent on this piece of plexiglass, cracks, but I figured, no worries, it's like an ATM machine, maybe it's like an urban environment, they'll think that the crack should be there or something like that, and I keep on going, I finally show up on Friday afternoon. The crew is showing up there. They're going to film all weekend long, and the set's not built. And they're like, where the hell is the set? I'm like, well, it's almost built. And I'm running around. I'm trying to take care of everything. I should point out that in both of these jobs, I didn't ask for anybody's help. That's another problem. I'm running around, and I've been up now for 60 hours. So I'm every bit as cogent as you could imagine. I'm completely frazzled. I'm sweaty. I feel terrible. I feel really bad that I'm in this situation, but again, I'm not spending too much time feeling bad because, well, it's just time to get the job done. I'm trying to put the ATM machine in, but there's other things that need to be dealt with that I haven't spoken to other people about. There's people I should have interfaced with. The flats themselves look terrible. They've spent all this time in this hot apartment in Brooklyn, and they've warped, and they've got folds in them, which don't look very wall-like at all. And at one point, this crew member says to me, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I thought that maybe a line from Raiders of the Lost Ark might be appropriate here. And I said, "I don't know, I'm making this up as I go along." And it was clear that my joke missed its mark, because he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Go home. We no longer need your help here." And I went home, and I felt bad. I felt really bad. And on Monday morning, I went to pick up my tools from the house, figuring they'd shot all weekend long. I knew that there was a loadout on Sunday, but I figured they didn't want me there. I was wrong, by the way, and they were so angry that I wasn't there. I'll tell you how angry they were. I went to pick up my tools, and where my toolbox was a note that said, "We have your tools. Call Gabby." Now, I called Gabby, and again, remember I said, Gabby and I were very close. I called Gabby, and Gabby said, I know there's kids in the audience, so I'm not going to use the curses. But Gabby said, "What did you do? What did you do to me? I trusted you. I trusted you to deliver this thing, and you spent $850 of money that this guy made working in a convenience store at like $4 an hour. You spent his hard-earned money. I want you to come here right now and account for every fracking penny that you spent, because I frankly don't see it." And if there was, I'm getting actually chills as I'm about to say this, she said the worst thing I've ever heard someone say to me. She said, "If there was any way you could have convinced me that you were not worth being friends with, you've done it." And I hung up the phone, and I called up my dad, and I just started crying into the phone. And I've never felt worse in my whole life. I've lost a friend. I mean, I didn't screw up a job. I've lost a friend. And honestly, I can't remember what he said. I don't ever remember anything my dad said, except I remember that the sound was very soothing. And I do remember one of the concepts that he said at that point was, there's nothing you can do except own up to it and apologize and know that, you don't get yourself into this kind of situation again. That's all you can do. You cannot fix it, you cannot make it right, and you might not be able to recover this friendship. So I went to Gabby, and astonishingly managed to account for every penny in the budget. I had all the receipts. To this day, I don't know how that works. Given the level of my disheveled brain, I have no idea how I counted for every penny, but I did. And then Gabby said, "The crew is in the room next door, and they'd like to speak with you." Now I'm thinking this is going to be like, I'm thinking this is going to be like Animal House, where the guy opens the door and someone punches him in the face, and then they kick him when he's down. And the way I feel, that would be a relief. The way I feel, I'm thinking as I'm opening this door, this is what I want. This is how bad I feel. I want these guys to beat the crap out of me for how awful I feel. Instead, I open the door on a room that is And I am not exaggerating at all. It is a dark room with like the entire crew, 20 guys, surrounding the perimeter of the room in chairs, and there is a chair in the middle of the room, and there is a spotlight on the chair. And honestly, this thought goes through my head. Well, at least now it makes a good story. And so I go, and I boop, I sit down in the chair, because now I'm ready, okay. And the director pulls out this pad of paper, and he starts going through this list of everything that I screwed up. I mean, he's really taken the time, piece by piece, moment by moment, task by task, to list out everything that I said I would do that didn't get done. From everything that should have been painted, to a model I should have demonstrated, to a meeting we should have had, to a phone call I should have made. And each list item he demonstrates, a crew member from the perimeter of the room will go, yeah, man, that really pissed me off too. They're adding in their 2 cents. To add insult to injury, when they were loading out, I was all the way across town having a date, and they found out. It seemed like I was so cavalier. Of course, I was just running from my problems. I was running from my troubles, attempting to assuage them with a woman, which is a bad idea, kids. Most of the time. And they spent about 45 minutes taking me through this tour of what I had done. And in a way, it was incredibly cathartic. It allowed me to really take it in, and it allowed me to actually, when they finished, they said, do you have anything you want to say? And I said, honestly, what can I say? I know there's not a thing that you missed. You're absolutely 100% right. I have done this terrible thing, and I cannot fix it. I cannot make it right. I can't give you back your money. I can't give you back your film. And I am deeply, deeply, profoundly sorry that I've done this to you. And I know that in and of itself also means nothing. And for that too, I'm sorry on 3 meta levels of sorry. I didn't say it like that. Now, what did I get out of that? Well, about a year later, my friend Mia, who's an editor in Hollywood, she called me up and said a storyboard artist, a very renowned storyboard artist in Hollywood, was going to direct his first short film, and he was looking for an art director. His name is Jeff Balsemeyer, and he's a wonderful artist. And I went and had a meeting with him, and he showed me this beautiful idea for a film and this wonderful set he wanted to build of a kid who gets so angry his room leaves the building he lives in. It actually shoves itself through the wall. And I said this looked like a lovely thing to build, but I couldn't take this job on alone. And I looked at this look of shock in his eyes, because I think Mia had represented me as someone who could do this job. And I said, I couldn't take this job. I couldn't take the responsibility for this job solely. I'd need someone to work with me on it. And he said, well, okay, I think we're going to go look for someone else. Now, I lost that job. And had I gotten that job, my life might have turned out very differently. I felt very good in that meeting, letting the job go, knowing what I know about my resistance to ask for help. There was a situation in which I was presented with something that was more than I could chew, and I turned it down. And I forever feel good about that decision. But so these things, these 2 failures, they're deeply important parts of my character. There's not a job that I do that I don't think back to something that happened on each of those 2 jobs. When I feel like I've screwed something up, and I mean, it's happened on the show dozens and dozens of times, that feeling I feel goes right back to that feeling I feel when Gabby told me that I was no longer her friend. I feel that bad sometimes about messing things up. But that's also what makes me good at what I do. That's a really important part. And if I had not gone down those paths to screw up, I would not be enjoying the life that I'm enjoying now. I had to screw up those jobs. Those were vital for me to do. I thought of this analogy. Everyone with kids knows that you give a kid a rule and they're going to break it. You give them a boundary and they're going to push up against it. And there's a lovely way of describing it. I can't remember where I read it that said, kids are just trying to figure out the shape of the world. You picture them like a blind person in a room they're just going up against the wall. The wall is the boundary you've set for them. They're trying to figure out the shape of the world by banging into the boundaries you've presented, which is why kids that don't get any rules get so freaked out. The world doesn't have a shape to it. I believe this. And I think actually that the kind of failures that we end up doing professionally as adults are just like that. I mean, for me, it's not the shape of the world I'm figuring out, it's the shape of my intuition. It's the shape of my ability to think through the worst case scenario and figure out exactly how I'm going to circumvent it. It's the problems I don't know are going to occur, but I can smell them in the distance because of certain flavor that I've paid attention to before when I really messed something up. So what I wanted to share with this was not just to say, I've failed more than I succeeded, and so, don't be afraid to go ahead and try things that you might screw up at. I wanted to point out, by telling this unvarnished, these two jobs were 100% my fault. I didn't ask for help, I didn't have the resources, I didn't have the knowledge, and worst of all, I felt really, really powerful in my knowledge of what I was doing. I thought, I've got this wired. And man, every time I have ever thought, I've got this wired, I was delivered a big plate of crow to eat. And so I finish with this analogy. I was thinking of a road analogy. I was thinking, well, so if failure gives you this kind of shape to your intuition, what does success give you? Well, I mean, what is success? Success is moving forward. Success is being able to build on what you've done and continue to do it and move forward. So if I think of success as the road, I think of failure as the car you're driving. It's the car that I'm driving, at least. It's the vehicle by which I move forward. It's those incremental steps. Because no one ever goes just in you're never going in just one direction. You're always getting knocked back. You're always getting batted off to the side. You're always trying to refine your bearings. And that's super, super important, super vital. And I hope I've properly communicated it. Thank you. Now, if you guys want me to take questions from the audience, I'd be happy to.
We've got a big cane.
You've got a big cane.
We've got a big cane that will pull you off the stage when it's your time. But we've got a bunch of time for questions.
Terrific.
If you're up for that.
I am very much. So I'd love to take questions from the audience on anything and everything.
Who fails more than they succeeds? You're all real makers. Who's got a question? I'm going to jump down there.
Sure.
How do you become a mythbuster? The most common I haven't the slightest idea. You got to wait for one of us to die, because we're not giving up the job easy. Although, after, 170 hours of programming, our number might be up.
Did you ever, how did you get into the job of being a mythbuster?
How did I get into the job of being a mythbuster? Well, what's that?
Getting into the Mythbuster business last year?
Yes, but I think I can put a different spin on it. I have always been a maker. My father was a painter. He was an artist. And I was very much encouraged to make things from the earliest age. In fact, by the time I was 10 or 11, I had unfettered access to the charge account at the local hardware store in town. Now, I didn't abuse that privilege. I may have only spent like 20 or 30 bucks a week, but that hardware store was like my training ground. And to this day, I just love sitting there in hardware stores looking at the wall and thinking about what I might, look at that, a flashlight I haven't seen. So that led to a career of varying many different types of careers. Graphic design, animation. I tried absolutely everything. I had very little focus for a long, long time until I found the theater industry. And the theater industry is great for people with talent but not much focus, because you can try everything you want there. Theater is theater is the one art form that will survive an apocalypse intact. Like the day after the apocalypse, someone's going to put on a show. I swear, and it's going to be funny. So from theater, I fell into the film industry, and from the film industry, when they were casting for Mythbusters, they were looking for people who worked in special effects because they were looking for people with a broad range of skills, which whether it's computer-generated or actual, people in special effects tend to be polymaths. That means they tend to want to absorb information about everything they can see, and that makes them really good at understanding the big picture. It also makes them good at animating, diesel rigs crashing into buildings and stuff like that because they're thinking about all the systems going on at once. And the rest is history.
What was one of your favorite myths on the show?
My favorite myths on the show. It changes constantly. Has anyone seen Swimming in Syrup? Dude, let me tell you about Swimming in Syrup. There was so much. That was my story. I labored over that story for about 6 months before we shot it. I was dying to do it, and the problem is when you start to look into, well, where do I start? Okay, so the myth is that swimming in syrup is just as fast as swimming in water because the decrease in your forward momentum is offset by the increased push you get off the thicker material. But of course we know that there's going to be a threshold. No one can swim fast in honey, okay? So what is that threshold? I started to call around, and I found out that the career title for people whose interest is viscosity are called tribologists. And I called the National Tribologist Society and talked to their president, and he immediately, I wouldn't say that he was yelling at me, but he was viscosity is not a constant. You think of viscosity as like something like hardness, like this table has a Shore D hardness or what have you. Viscosity isn't like that. Viscosity is dependent on all sorts of different factors, like how fast the material is moving. The temperature might change the viscosity of something hundreds of percentage points across a temperature span. So trying to figure out, we knew that in the narrative of the episode we wanted to demonstrate a syrup that was equivalent to swimming in water, which we knew that some researchers had done in the Midwest, which was a double thickness, but it didn't look any different than water. Then we knew we wanted to go to the overdone threshold of like super, super goopy, and then we knew we wanted to hit this middle ground. And all three the first one we knew. The other two were wild-ass guesses based on just a lot of conversation. But that's one of the favorite parts of the job is calling around, talking to the experts, having them tell you they don't know how to give you the figure, but maybe if they had to pull it out of their butt, they would say 1,500 times viscosity, and you think about that based on what the other guy said, and then you order 4,000 pounds of guar gum and hope that it works. And when it does, it feels really good. So Swimming in Syrup is my new favorite episode.
What's your favorite explosion you've done?
My favorite explosions remain hot water heaters. Dude! Those things put out a thud that is so satisfying. We've got a new shooting location. We're now using frequently the landfill out at Altamont because they can kind of give us whatever we want. They've got these big dirt pits, and they can make a grade, they can do whatever we need. They've got all this earth-moving equipment. So, that we did the hot water heaters the first time through a single-story house, and we got a lot of email from people saying that they lived in two-story houses, so what about that? So we built a two-story house out at Altamont, and we attempted to shoot a hot water heater through it. I won't tell you the result, but I will tell you that even from like a quarter mile away, my friend John and his kids who were watching said, you felt it in the chest. It's just, I never get tired of watching those things blow up. And it's actually not technically an explosion. It's actually, I think, a conflagration. It's if you notice in the first time I have to say this, if you notice that little red house I built with the window, when the hot water heater destroys that house, the window's not broken. Which tells me I don't think that there's a shock wave there. It's just a push. It's just pressure. So I don't think it's technically an explosion. Although if it happened to you, no one would deny you that it exploded.
How did you and Jamie first think of the idea of testing myths on a show?
It's an interesting genesis of the show because as originally conceived, it's not our idea, by the way. Jamie and I were hired talent at the beginning. But the original concept for the show was very different than it is now. They actually were going to have 3 hosts. They didn't think they could find 2 guys interesting enough to host the show, so their plan was to have a hot chick who would go around the country interviewing people about myths, and then she'd call up her boys in San Francisco, and they would build experiments to test the theses that she was hearing. And apparently when they saw our demo reel, they changed the structure of the show. They altered it. They realized that we might be able to actually do this. And so the way the show took shape out of our interest level and the varying degrees of our ignorance grew out of that decision to let us run with it. I sense a question over there because that's where the microphone's traveling.
Brody.
Wow, I've been waiting a couple of years to ask this. How did you get into the special effects industry? I'm a theater technician and a film student and really trying to get into the industry, and I was just wondering, how do you make that segue into special effects?
It's funny because I made it in a really strange way. I had tried to work in special effects several times in my early 20s. I went to places in New York. Eli Wallach's son, Peter Wallach, is an amazing special effects artist who did the early Peter Gabriel animated clay videos. I worked for Peter for a couple of months, but the pay was so crappy. It was so crappy that even at like 19, you knew you were getting taken advantage of. It was like $50 a day. Like you showed up at 7 and worked until they told you to leave. It was appalling. And I worked there for a couple of weeks, and then I stopped working there because I couldn't deal. And there was a place called Brooklyn Model Works. I worked for them. Actually, I went and interviewed with them, and when they called me up and said, "We'd like to hire you, but it's like $250 an hour," I was like, "Really?" And they said, "Well, you said you'd work for free." And I was like, "Oh, wow, really? I said that?" So I worked for them for a week, and then I didn't go back. It turned out that even though I really wanted to work in special effects, I was uncompromising about this employment thing, which was I can't work in places where people are really unhappy and I'm not learning anything. So for the longest time, I had every job for either an hour or a year. And if I went into a place, Pizza Uno, to work as a waiter, I'd spend an hour meeting people and be like, "I'm going to go get a Coke," and then I would never go back. And this meant that I had to sponge a lot of rent off my parents through my 20s. But I didn't go to college, so I figured they made out. But I kept on following this axiom of jobs that I found really interesting. And each one led to the next one. Each thing I was doing led to the next thing I was doing. When I moved out to San Francisco, it just so happened that the first job that was available was working as a carpenter in the George Coates Performance Works down in the basement of the McAllister Hastings Law School building. And that was an incredible training ground because it was everybody doing everything, and technology from everything from stone tools to digital 3D projectors. And I got to play a part in all of that. Every time, another thing that I've always, which is I have been uncompromising about bad workplace environments, but I've also been very keyed into what I want. And when I do want something, I ask for it. It's pretty straightforward, but a lot of people who've worked for me don't do it, and I've had to ferret out of them what they want out of the situation. But when I worked at Industrial Light and Magic, the first thing I wanted to know was, who builds the spaceships around here? How do I build a spaceship? And Larry Tan, my wonderful guardian angel, the first guy I worked with at ILM, said, "You want to talk to the Johns, Goodson and Duncan." And they're still good friends of mine. And I learned a lot from working with those guys. So each time I saw an opportunity, I really went for it, and I made sure that I was able to try and partake of that opportunity.
What was your most spectacular failure ever on the show?
On the show. It actually happened, I just got back from a camp yesterday from the Carson City Rock Products Quarry, where we were hurling cars off of cliffs. But it's a very, very unforgiving location. It was 95 yesterday, which was kind of a vacation compared to the 22,000-foot fall. On the 22,000-foot fall, which is the myth that a World War II bombardier fell 22,000 feet but into a train station that was exploding as he hit it, and the shock wave actually cushioned his fall. So we built this fake train station, and we got this 500 pounds of high-speed explosives, and we rigged up this balloon with a dummy on it to drop on a cable. The rig was all my design. But it was this is a heat wave about 3 years ago. It was 115 degrees in the shade. And brutally, brutally, brutally hot. And so dry that we weren't actually allowed to film after 10:30 in the morning because the fire risk was too high. So we were showing up on set at 3 in the morning and working by the headlights of our cars in order to get this explosion to happen by like 9 a.m. so we could then talk about it for an hour afterwards. And on the day of the final experiment, the order of operations were that the balloon had to get filled, the weather balloons had to get filled up enough to lift Buster, and then Buster, who was tethered to the ground, had to be lifted up. But see, we had guide cables on the weather balloons for wind because it was very windy, and we had Buster on a guide cable down towards the building. It was all these different lines. And when you're lifting something and you're transferring the weight of something from, let's say, a stake in the ground to a balloon in the air, the transition, I now know, is the most dangerous point in the operation, because I didn't perceive how much force there would be when I cut the little piece of parachute cord keeping Buster tethered to the ground. And when I did, all hell broke loose. Two of the guys holding the guy wires got rope burns in their hand from the guy's wire whipping through their hands. Buster shot north and then fell back down again, luckily not on me. The weather balloon, 2 of the weather balloons ripped. We only had 3 more in the world, and we had already bought all the weather balloons that were available to us by Federal Express from anywhere in the United States. And so here it was, a Friday. We've already been working all week in 115-degree heat, and in this very moment that this happens, I realized that we are all going to have to come back the next day. And that I felt really, 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 really awful. And I called up my wife, and she said, you know, you do get it right most of the time. Like, you can take solace in the fact that almost every other time at the end of the week for the last shot, the sun's going down, you guys actually get it. So if you miss it occasionally, you can rest in the fact that you know you get it most of the time. It's not like you were lazy. So, you know, chill out. And I did, and we got the shot the next day, and it was still awful and hot, but we nailed it. There we are.
Kind of rubber at that store you were at that had that rubber. It felt like it was kind of liquidy, and it felt sticky. And what was that rubber store you were at?
Where's your rubber store?
Well,
With the sticky, what was it? Like shark skin or tacky, or what was it? Kind of sticky.
oh,
What
with like a
kind of,
self-stick back?
What kind of project was it that he was working on? A store in San Francisco. What are your favorite sources in San Francisco for these materials?
Oh, yeah. The self-stick rubber is hard to find. I love I love my Center Hardware. I love those guys. They really know what they're doing. I begrudgingly frequent Tap Plastics, although their prices tend to upset me. I love Douglas and Sturgis, which is unbelievable that we have such a resource in our city. The casting materials, I've been buying from them for 20 years. What else? Scrap. Does everyone know Scrap? The San Francisco Unified School District reclamation place where if you donate materials, this is where it goes out to the... I went there as a sculptor, as an early maker in San Francisco. I would go to Scrap every weekend. And it's right around the corner from one of our shops, and I still go occasionally. I actually own... 20 years ago at the Exploratorium, they had a magnetite separator, which you could take some of the sand from Ocean Beach and pour it in the top and turn a dial, and it would separate it out, regular sand and the magnetite. And I was in Scrap probably about 10 years ago, and it was there. And I was like, this is an Exploratorium, because it still had the label. And they're like, yeah. And I was like, how much is it? And the people at Scrap went away, and they talked amongst themselves, and they came back, and they were like, it's $50? And honestly, at that point, at that moment in time, I had like $60 in my bank account, but I was like, okay. And I still have it in storage. It's one of my favorite objects. Scrap is amazing.
I've got a question. What's your favorite tool?
God, that's so hard. It's hard to beat a sharp knife. I mean, I don't have one on my belt right now, which is shocking. A Leatherman and a sharp knife are two things that are never more than an arm's length away from me, except for right now, which you should take as an anomaly. There is a tool called a portaband, which is a portable bandsaw. And Milwaukee has seen fit to make one battery-powered. And that portable bandsaw, it's expensive. They're about $400. But man, I use it so much, the crew jokes that someday I'm going to make lunch with it. I use it for everything because it's totally silent and it will cut through anything. I mean, you could probably get a car boot off with this. It's incredible, and it just moves nice and slow, makes nice, precise cuts, and it's totally quiet. I love that.
What was the most challenging myth you experimented on?
The most challenging, it's hard to say. I mean, they all present, the challenges that we're confronted with are a lot more than just trying to figure out how to, well, the challenge is always how to tell the story. So often the ones that are most challenging are actually some of the more boring myths because we're trying to figure out, like, out of something that, like this. I mean, the producers, Jamie and I provide probably a good 2/3 of the material that we do, but we get ideas from our producers, and at one point he said, we want to do a household objects show. And we're looking at this outline, and it's like, oh, come on. And, oh, wait a minute, duct tape. And he says, yeah, duct tape. We were thinking you guys could do something funny with duct tape. And we were like, do something funny with, we could do a whole hour on duct tape. Hell, we could do a season on duct tape. And he's like, really? And Jamie goes, have you seen the show? And so then we did a full hour on duct tape. Cary Grant and Tori did something unbelievable with duct tape, and Jamie and I, we did 3 kind of amazing things with duct tape, including we made a boat. That's all I'm going to say. I'm not going to tell you if it worked or not, but we made a boat, and it's very funny.
Hi. I've seen, I can't remember what the context was. I think it might have been in the context of trying to recreate the JATO experiment and have the car lift off where the rocket engine exploded catastrophically and it just destroyed the whole experiment. Yeah. So you've been on the receiving end of people's incredibly bad failures, and I'm kind of curious how you handle that now, because you're in the situation now where you're kind of high up there and people are working for you and doing these things for you. So
yeah, I don't feel bad about those at all because they're not my fault. It was a big disappointment. That JATO car takeoff was a very big disappointment. And in fact, that was one of the more difficult, from a production standpoint. The last thing we wanted to do right then was film more of a TV show. We had spent weeks thinking through all the possible things that could go wrong with getting this car lined up to a ramp, with the budget that we had, which was tiny, the location that was difficult, trying to aim a car, trying to eliminate remote control, do cable release, drag the car, all of these different systems, and every last one of them worked. Every last one of the things that we planned worked the way we planned it to work, except the one thing that we didn't have control over. And honestly, actually, I took real solace in that. I was really pleased with our rig. So in the end, I was like, damn, our rig worked. Too bad about those exploding rockets. It actually makes us more, it makes us more cautious. You know, we've got a myth coming up where Jamie wants to launch me off of a car at 70 miles an hour safely. Or he wants to launch himself. But I was picturing, I can't tell you the context, but I was picturing myself being set into a mechanism that would launch me off a car at 70 miles an hour. And there's pretty much only 2 people I would trust with the release pen. And one of them's me, and the other one's Jamie. The fact is, when push comes to shove, even though we drive each other nuts and we get really pissed off at each other every single day, whenever we leave things in other people's hands, it's a variable we don't know. But we know that when each other has control over the thing that we're doing, we know that it's going to work the way we think it is.
I'm a a big fan of the show. So I've seen you do a lot of explosions. So I heard you say that you really like the explosion a lot where Sparky, the robot Sparky that you and Jamie built, blew up that barrel of keg. And I heard you say that it was the most satisfying one you've ever done. So I'm wondering why you said that the exploding water heater was your favorite one.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Yeah, that's great. I am, if you're a regular watcher of the show, I am given to hyperbole. Hyperbole means that I say everything is brilliant, everything's amazing, everything's the most fun I've ever had, everything's awesome. And I really do feel like that at that moment. But upon reflection, when you ask me to choose my favorite, and I go back over and I think, because at this point, explosions for us are kind of like fine wines, right? Like each one's got a flavor, like, ooh, that's a sharp snap, but a deep throaty rumble on the back end. Oh, that made the ground move. Sneakers, that one. My hair blew back. Oh, the shockwave was really nifty. Wow, that was a real dud, you know. So when I go back through all of those types of explosions, and most of the time I have to say working with live explosives is more terrifying than not, because they're live explosives, and the only solace you can take when working with them is that if something happens, you won't notice. I've sat on a duffel bag full of 300 pounds of cast boosters in Telluride, throwing them out of a helicopter window to start avalanches. And again, and I thought, at least it'll be quick. So the hot water heater, I think, is not only my favorite because I love the throaty rumble of the hot water heater, but it's also one that I have total control over and one I feel very safe doing. It's like a known parameter. Those things, it's very difficult to find things that fail reliably. And hot water heaters are one of them.
Adam, do you read Make Magazine?
Yeah, absolutely. I read Make Magazine every issue. I love it. I wish it was around when I was a kid.
You know, Adam and I remember when it wasn't cool to be a maker. And it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't cool to be into electronics. It wasn't cool to be into computers. And now we know it's the coolest thing in the world. And we all come together and just geek out on it and love it. And, you know, the closest thing that we had, did you read Byte Magazine, CRC's column in Byte?
No.
He had this great column where he'd build hardware homebrew projects, and that kind of got wrung out of computers as it went to software. And that's what's so great about this with hardware. What are your favorite projects in Make?
Oh, God. I love the LED throwies. That's one of the simplest, most elegant little bits of delicious techno-vandalism. That's just great. I love the magnet stuff, and I actually really love the hardware hacking. Because, you know, it's one thing that there was this point as everything was becoming more and more advanced that people were saying, well, no one's going to be taking apart their TVs anymore and doing stuff to them. And we're past that, and people are reprogramming the boards of their computer. I'm working on a project right now, and someone may have to help me with this. I've got a stereo in my car, but I have an old Land Cruiser, and it's hard to drive while adjusting the stereo, so I bought a remote control for the stereo. But what I want is to make my own buttons for the remote control, so I've pulled out the board, and I'm trying to wire right to the board so that I can control my stereo. And that's, to me, something that I wouldn't have done had I not been reading Make for the last few years.
Anybody willing to help Adam out on that? He's got a project here. Adam, can you join us over here and sign some autographs for a few minutes?
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Hey, everybody, thank you so much. I'll see you next year.